Hello, hello, and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to do a book haul revisit. This is where I look back at January's past and see how many of the books I brought into my library in this month I have read, how many I would still like to read, how many I might have already gotten rid of, and think about whether or not there are any in here that I might consider unhauling. So we are going to look at book hauls from January of 2020, January 2021, and January of 2022. We're going to start with the most recent and work our way back. And as with most cases, the oldest book haul is the largest in this case, and we will do that. I will say, as a note, I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about what each book is about. If you would like that information, I will have links to the original book haul videos in the description box down below. You can follow through to that video for more about each book individually. And we have 3 years of book hauls to cover, so let's immediately jump in and get going. We are starting with January of 2022. The first book is The Membranes by Ta-Wei, translated by Larissa, Heinrich. This was something that I picked up for last year's LGBTQ+ in translation read-along, which at the time Chen, the librarian, had announced that I was in the process of getting involved in. So actually, the first 2 books are from that, because the second one is To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life by Hervé, Guibert, and this one does not have the translator on the cover, so give me a moment. It is translated by Linda Coverdale. So, starting with The Membranes, this one is a success story. I did read this book and really enjoyed the conversation that we had about it. It's a very interesting book in the LGBTQ+ canon, and we had a great discussion about it as part of the group. And as a side note, we have sort of shifted the LGBTQ+ in translation read-along. So this year it is a queer TBR tackle, and I will put a link down below to the video I did that sort of announces the books that we have selected for it and what we are hoping to do with that. But this really got the LGBTQ+ in translation read-along from last year kicked off very strongly. I am still interested in reading To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life, but I did not manage to read it last year. I think that was the pick for February, and I got overwhelmed with some other things that I was doing in February, and always intended to circle back to it throughout the year, but with the best of intentions, I did not manage to do that. So I read this one, didn't get to this one, but I would still like to, and I think it is perfectly fine taking up room on my shelves. The next one that I got in January of 2022 was for my Pulitzer Prize project. It is the Franklin Library edition of In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow. This is the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction winner from the year 1942, and if you follow along, you know I am sort of in love with these Franklin Library editions of the Pulitzer Prize winners. So this is part of my Pulitzer Prize project, in which I am trying to read all of the books that have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So I haven't gotten to it yet, but I fully intend to, and you will hear more about that project when I film my library tour, because this is your sneak peek of the new library. I also filmed another video in here already, so you're getting a sneak peek, but I will do a full tour, and when I do, we will talk a lot more about the Pulitzer Prize books that I have in my library. The next one from January of 2022 is Still Life by Sarah Winman. I have not managed to read it yet. I think I would read her other book, which is, for some reason, I want to call it Tin Man, and it is Tin Man. So I would probably prioritize that one over this one, but I've heard really good things about both. So I do still want to read both of them. And Still Life is a very pretty book. It's a little bit large, but I am totally fine having it hang out on my library shelf until I manage to read both Tin Man and Still Life. So it's not going anywhere either. And unfortunately, the final book from my January of 2022 book haul did go somewhere. It has already been unhauled. It is Fiona and Jane by Jean Chen Ho. So in spring and then again in summer of last year, I really had to make some tough decisions about space because I did not have room in my library. And this was sort of the beginning of the end for me and Book of the Month Club. I really wanted a copy of Still Life, and I believe it was an add-on, so I needed to pick another book in order to get it. So I kind of went along with this one because it sounded interesting. But then I heard people whose opinion on books I vibe with, whose opinion I respect, say that they thought this was just okay. And when I was having a really big crunch in terms of space in my library, okay was not going to cut it. So I lost the urgency to read the book, and I made a tough call and got rid of it. So of the 5 books that I brought into my library in January of 2022, I've only read one, and that was The Membranes. But I still want to read To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life. I still want to read Still Life, and I still want to read In This Our Life by Ellen Glasgow. And I am steadily collecting editions of every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So it's not going anywhere either. So these are totally fine sticking around. The only one that would have potentially been on the bubble would have been Fiona and Jane. So I don't think I regret having already gotten rid of that one. That takes us to January of 2021, and the first book that I hauled in that month was The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. I did read this book almost immediately after it was released, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite reads from 2021, and I am, as such, very happy to have it on my shelf. It's a success story. I read it. I loved it. It gives me joy when I see it on my shelf. Big success story, so happy to continue to have this book. The next one was My Friend Dahmer by Derf, Backderf. This was something that was recommended to me by someone in a bookstore here where I live, and I am a little iffy on true crime because I don't like it when it sort of glorifies the serial killer. But this is about, so Derf Backderf went to high school with Jeffrey Dahmer. So it's about his experience and the experience of other students. And I apologize for Jamie barking. UPS just drove by, so she hates that. And how they definitely noticed that something was off, but they didn't think the worst because, why would you think the worst? So it's more about the lasting impact, and it's about someone who sort of slipped through the system because there were definitely warning signs that something was wrong at the time, and it's sort of grappling with that. So it was an interesting read. I'm glad that I did read it. I don't know that I will keep it forever, but it is definitely something that's fine living on my shelves for now. And it is a success story in that I did manage to read it. And the next one is Born to be Posthumous, The Eccentric Life and Mysterious Genius of Edward Gorey, which I have not gotten around to reading. I've wanted to read this for a very long time. And in January of 2021, usually in the beginning of the year, I get sort of gift cards that I can use to order books. And I had wanted to read this book since it was released, which was a long time ago at this point. It's copyright 2018. And my library never got a copy of it. It was never released in paperback. And there were no audio copies of this book available on any of my subscription apps. So in January of 2021, I decided I had a gift card for a bookstore, and I decided I'm just going to order it for myself. Wouldn't you know it, the same year, I believe they released a paperback, just the way it works. But I'm still interested in the book, and I love this cover, so it is actually faced out on my shelf right now. I will keep it. I would be more likely to listen to the audio, but it is something that I'm still interested in reading, and I look forward to reading as well. And the next one is A Boy's Own Story by Edmund White. I had wanted to read this book for a couple of years. I took the opportunity of having a gift card for a bookstore to order a copy, and here it is. I have not gotten around to reading it yet. I would still like to. This is a really big candidate to be on my pile of possibilities for Pride Month, because in June, I like to really focus in on LGBTQ plus authors and their stories and books highlighting the community and things like that, and this is a queer classic, so I am very much looking forward to getting to it, and in the meantime, it is totally fine hanging out on my shelf with my other books. And the same is true of Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. This is another book I had ordered with the gift card that I had in January of 2021. I haven't gotten around to reading it, still really want to. Prime candidate to be on my pile of possibilities for Pride Month when that comes around this year. And I've heard so many good things about this book. I really look forward to catching up to it. So it's not going anywhere either. And then we get to a book called A Matter of Life and Sex by Oscar Moore. I'm going to be careful as I hold it up because this book, well, one, it shines in the light, but also it's got a little bit of dudity. There's a booty on here. So I'm going to cover that with my finger. This was something that Sean the Book Maniac had talked about at some point on his channel, and that really caught my attention, which sounded interesting to me. So I ordered a used copy because I believe it is out of print right now. I haven't gotten around to reading it, but this to me is sort of like a library builder. I did not have immediate plans to read it when I got it. I don't have immediate plans to read it right now, but it is a really interesting LGBTQ plus book, and it is fine living on my shelf until I get around to reading it. And actually the same is true of the book Safe as Houses by Alex Jeffers. I believe in whatever video Sean talked about A Matter of Life and Sex, he also talked about Safe as Houses, and same thing happened. I looked for a used copy online, and it was just a library builder, something that I wanted to have so that when the mood struck, I would have it here and be ready to read it. I might actually potentially get to it this year because I'll talk about it in a subsequent video when I talk about goals and intentions for 2023, and as much as I have them. But on the Montana Book Company Reading Challenge for 2023, there is a prompt to read a book with members of the deaf community. So I have another book that I'm probably more likely to read, but this is also, I believe the protagonist is the children of deaf parents. He's a coda. So that would be an interesting one to use for that as well. And then the final book from January of 2021 is The Removed by Brandon Hobson. This was also a victim of last summer's purge, when I really needed room and had to think about what I was really likely to read and what I could feasibly get rid of without causing too much pain. And I am still interested in reading this book, but I looked and I believe the audio of it was on Scribd. So I have it saved to my list, and I figured I will likely get to it in that format if and when I do finally get to it. So that was a tough decision because I do still want to read the book, but it's available on audio, and I think I'm much more likely to get to it in that format. So of the 8 books I brought into my library in January of 2021, I have read 2, and those are The Prophets and My Friend Dahmer, not My Fred Dahmer. And I have Unhauled 1, which was The Removed. And as I said, I'm not really married to the idea of keeping My Friend Dahmer forever. If and when I need space in that area, I could potentially get rid of it, but I enjoyed it enough to keep it for now. So it will continue living there. And that is January of 2021. Which of course takes us to January of 2020, which starts off with a bang because this is where I had a copy of American Dirt by Janine Cummins. I ended up reading this, I believe, the same year for the BookTube Prize, which I was participating at that time, and I really did not like it, and it ended up being one of my least favorite books of the year, and I'm pretty sure I held on to the book long enough to talk about it in my BookTube Prize wrap-up, and then as soon as that was done, it was out the door and taken to my local used bookstore where it was traded in, and I have never looked back. I have never regretted it. It was awful. And the next one is The Big Goodbye, Chinatown and the Last Years of Hollywood by Sam Wasson. Sam Wasson wrote the book Fifth Avenue 5 a.m., but he also wrote the book Fosse, which is about Bob Fosse, as you can imagine, and which was the source of the TV show Fosse Verdon. And I liked that book, although I had a couple of little issues with it. However, I did enjoy the glimpse into Hollywood or Broadway and sort of celebrity life. It does involve Hollywood because Bob Fosse obviously became a film director, enough that I would absolutely read another one of Sam Wasson's books. If you follow along, you know I'm really interested in old Hollywood and the Academy Awards. Chinatown was a big Academy Awards player in the year in which it was released. So, and I'm also really interested in the transition from the old studio system to the current environment for movies, and the 70s is a big player in that, so this would be a very interesting book to look at as part of that. So it is going to hang out on my shelf. I'm much more likely to listen to it on audio, but because I do really like old Hollywood and books about movies and things like that, it's totally fine hanging out on my shelf until I do get to it, and we'll see how that goes. The next book is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. I was really excited to read this, but I didn't get to it until the BookTube Prize. Again, I participated in that, I think in the following year, and that prompted me to read it. I really liked it a lot, and I am looking forward to reading more Brandon Taylor in the future, because I have not read his story collection that was released after this yet, and I believe he has a book coming out this year that I would like to read as well. So that was a success story. And then we come to Conditional Citizens by Leila Lalami, which I did manage to read and which I liked. I didn't love it, but I liked it a lot. And it was another victim of the Great Purge from last year, where I really needed space and had to make a lot of tough decisions. So it is not here anymore, but I did read it and I did actually like it. It was just a tough call. And then we have A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. I have this pocket edition from, I want to say, Picador Modern Classics. It's right there. And I ended up listening to this on audio, but I really liked it. It was one of my favorite reads in the year in which I read it. And I can't remember if that was 2020 or 2021, but I read it during Pride Month. And again, in the month of June, I like to prioritize LGBTQ plus authors, LGBTQ plus stories, and this was a natural fit for that. I can't remember who read the audiobook, but they did a fantastic job, and I really enjoyed the book. So I'm happy having this copy on my shelf, because it really fits in with what I like to have in my library, and it is a book that I really liked as well. And then we have Out by Natsuo Kirino, I believe is the author's name. It only shows the last name on the cover. So it's Natsuo Kirino, translated from the Japanese by Steven Snyder. In 2020, I was really obsessed with these vintage Japan editions of books, so I ordered a couple, and in the month of January, this was the only one that I got. It's a really beautiful edition of this book. I haven't gotten around to reading it. I know some people I follow on BookTube read it last year and really, really did not like it. That has given me a little bit of pause, but I'm still curious. So it's fine hanging out on my shelf until I eventually either read it or hear some more people talking about it and saying that it's bad. I'll see. If you've read Out, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. I would be very curious. And then we have The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I did eventually manage to read this as a buddy read with Erica from The Broken Spine, because it had been sitting on my shelf and she really wanted me to read it and she wanted to reread it. So we did it together. I have not gone on and done the rest of the books in the series. I liked it. I don't know why I get attitude about books that have like a cliffhanger and that you're supposed to immediately go on to the next book. I don't know why it just really trips a nerve in me. And this book does have a bit of a resolution, but it does seem, I just kind of hesitated about jumping right into the next book in the series. So I did not, and I have not yet. I will at some point. And it'll probably take me a while and I'll forget details about this one, but you know, it is what it is. I liked it and I will continue with the series at some point. N.K. Jemisin is a great writer. So I will make sure I get to it at some point. And the next one is Such a Long Journey, a novel by Rohinton Mystery. This was purchased for a very specific reason. So I had read A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mystery in 2019. It was one of my favorite reads from that year. It very nearly came in first place to be my favorite book of that year, but it was beaten out by another one in the end. But I really wanted to read another book by him. Sean the Book Maniac came up with the idea of doing a buddy read of this one with someone else. I can't remember who at this point, in the month of February. So I purchased it so I would have it and be ready for the buddy read. And then in the month of February, I ended up having surgery to repair an umbilical hernia and was out of commission for 2 weeks, possibly even longer. It was a really long, hard recovery from that, and I backed out of the buddy read in order to not fall behind or disappoint. So I let it go. And I would still be curious about reading another book by Rohinton Mystery at some point, but I have not gotten around to doing it yet. But it's fine hanging out in my library and not going anywhere at this point. The next one, unfortunately, was Cloud Street by Tim Winton, which I read. I did a buddy read with someone. I can't remember who at this point, but I did not like the book. And I have a whole video where I talk about why. I'll put a link to it in the description box down below. And I got rid of this book pretty immediately. I did not like it. So it's gone. And that's all I will say about that here. But that takes us to a success story, which is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. I had planned to do a different book first for my Pulitzer Prize for Fiction project. My original idea was that I was going to go in chronological order, start with the first book and go from there. And then I let go of the idea of going in chronological order, but I did still want to start with the first book. And here's where it gets interesting. I ended up doing Lonesome Dove first instead, and I still have not read the first book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. I can't explain myself. But anyway, I did read this right at the start of the pandemic. I had already started it. It ended up being a sort of long, drawn-out reading process because I was reading it when the everything shut down for the pandemic. And then I took my time getting through it because everything was really stressful. Imagine that. So I really took my time getting through it. I ended up over the course of 2 months, I think, reading it. And then I did a full video about it for my Pulitzer Prize project. And I'll have a link to that in the description box down below as well. Really great book. I loved it a lot. And want to read more books by Larry McMurtry. I will not continue that series. He later wrote some sequels and I believe at least one prequel. But I like Lonesome Dove as it is. I don't feel like I want a sequel or a prequel. So I would read other books of his. And actually I have some other books of his on my shelf as well. And then at my local used bookstore, I had decided that I wanted to read some Sarah Waters books. I can't remember if this was after I listened to the audio of The Paying Guests or if in June of 2020 I ended up listening to The Paying Guests. I believe it was 2019 when I did that. So I wanted to read more books by Sarah Waters. My local used bookstore had 3: Affinity, Fingersmith, and Tipping the Velvet. I have not gotten around to reading any of them yet. I still want to, and as fate would have it, I mentioned the 2023 Queer TBR Tackle, and as part of that, again, the video for that whole thing will be down below, but Jen the librarian and I each picked 3 books. We looked through our shelves to find the queer books that have been on our TBR the longest, and one of my 3 was Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. So that is actually the book that we are going to be reading in February. So I have concrete plans to finally get around to reading Fingersmith, and at some point in the future, I will get around to Affinity and Tipping the Velvet. So that will be just fine, and they are fine living on my shelves, even though they take up a lot of space, but that's fine. That's totally fine. I don't mind it. The last book that I hauled in January of 2020 was a book called Tightrope by Nicholas D. Kristoff and Cheryl Wudunn. I believe they are a husband and wife pair, and it's a sort of cultural study of small towns. I ultimately decided I wasn't that interested in reading it, and like the urgency died pretty quickly to get to it, and I feel like I'm much more likely to listen to it on audio if at all. So I ultimately decided to unhaul it. So it's not here anymore. So of the 14 books that I hauled in January of 2020, I've actually read 7. I have a 50% success rate in January of 2020, despite the fact that it is the largest of the 3 book hauls. So that's pretty good. And again, the books that I have read are American Dirt, Real Life, Conditional Citizens, A Single Man, The 5th Season, Cloud Street, and Lonesome Dove. And there were some hits in there. There were some big misses, but I have a 50% success rate, and I will take that. I have unhauled 3 books out of that 14. Those are American Dirt, Cloud Street, and Tightrope. So overall, if we lump all of these book hauls from January together, I brought 27 books into my library, and I've only read 10. That is not so good. But while there are some books that I would say might be on the cusp of an unhaul, I still feel interested in reading most of these. So that's pretty good. And I have only unhauled 5. So not bad either. But that's my success rate in January of 2022, January of 2021, and January of 2020. So if you have feedback or thoughts about any of the books, again, in particular, if you have read Out by Natsuo Corino, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.